Hey everyone, welcome back to Unwrap with Shobs. And today with me, I have the man himself, Mr. Garfield Gini-Newman, who has been in the teaching sector for the past 20 years. And his main work revolves around enhancing critical thinking skills. And in addition to this, he's also an assistant professor at University of Toronto and a senior national consultant at the Critical Thinking Consortium. So thank you so much, Mr. Garfield, for agreeing to do this with me.
Happy to do it. Thank you.
So today we're going to be focusing mostly on creativity and critical thinking skills, right? How do we enhance this in the workplace? I understand that your primary work has been with schools and the education sector, but I'm sure that most of these are transferable to workplaces as well. And that is what I have experienced through my work experience in the edtech sector. So let's begin with something very basic that I think most people must be thinking of, right? So what does being creative even mean?
Okay. So, I think an interesting place to start with that is a reminder that the word creative, the root of the word creative is to create. And so that means that we do something with our idea. So, someone who might come up with wild and crazy thoughts, but never act on the thoughts, we wouldn't ascribe the term creative that they're really creative individuals. So because they didn't produce, and it could be a theory, it could be a tangible product, a service, but something comes of that thinking. So that's the first piece, that to be creative is to create. Now, the second, and really what I'm outlining are the criteria that are generally used in the field of creativity research, that something is created, that something is novel, that, if I am able to replicate a song perfectly, I might be highly skilled as a musician, but that doesn't make me creative. I didn't create something novel. But I think the third one, which is most interesting to me, is not only is it novel, it's useful, it works. That if I have a creative idea to solve a problem, but it doesn't solve the problem, my idea may have been novel, but it didn't work. If I try to reimagine a song and it's a bit of a disaster, it doesn't work. So creativity, and this, by the way, this is where the critical part intersects with the creative part, that all creativity is a form of critical thinking, because not only do I generate new and novel ideas, but I have to be able to step back and say, is that working? Is it addressing the need that I saw, that I was trying to address? Is it meeting the needs of the audience that I was working for? So one of, the way I kind of came into a real interest in creativity and innovation was in fact through its intersection with critical thinking, because historically we've seen critical and creative as separate domains, that one's rigorous and logical and sequential and the other's not. And I think that they actually intersect far more than we have allowed sometimes, and that critical and creative, in fact, are domains or dimensions of good thinking. Good thinkers are willing, they're fluid, there's fluency, there's flexibility in thinking, but they're focused on purpose, audience. So we have this intersection. So it's a bit of a long answer, but creativity, I would argue, is a dimension of high quality thinking.
Yes, I think that definitely makes sense, right? Because right now what I am seeing is in every job description, everyone is like, we want someone who's creative, who can create something new. So when they put this out, the first thing that comes to my mind is, what habits can we imbibe in our everyday life so that we can build our creative thinking skills? It's not something like you wake up today and I'm like, yeah, I just want to be creative. It doesn't work like that, right? So how do you think we can build our creative capacity?
Well, I'm going to start by maybe quoting John Cleese, creativity and what allowed him to be, what made him so successful in writing skits. He tells the story of how a colleague of his was a naturally more gifted writer, had more natural talent, yet he said, I produce better skits. And he said, I wondered why. And he said, I realized that my colleague would come up with an idea and that's what they would run with. And he said, I didn't. I would stick around, I'd rework it. And this is the phrase that I love that I'll expand on. He said, I learned to live with the problem longer. And because I lived with the problem longer, I produce better skits. That to me is a fundamental piece. And I would argue it's time. It's give yourself time to try it, time for it not to work. The other piece, Andrew Staunton, who's a Pixar director, made Toy Story and other movies like that. His phrase, really short but powerful: fail early, fail fast. Because he would say in the movie industry, if you don't float your ideas out and figure out what's wrong and fix it, you invest millions and then you find out your movie's a flop. You want to fail early, fail fast. I would say in our lives, take risks early, allow yourself time to make mistakes and say, that didn't work. What else might I try? When we try to do things late, by the way, I would argue in education, we far too often make the task we give kids the proof at the end. We don't give them time to try something else and say, that didn't work. I wonder why. So I think perseverance, risk taking, to be creative, then we have to be willing to try things differently. And we have to be prepared for it not to work and say, I'm okay with that.
The traits that you mentioned is something we need to be comfortable with as individuals, right? But there's also another factor here wherein the place you're working at, they should be able to nurture a creative workspace as well, right? So,
Absolutely.
what kind of working environments should organizations be aiming towards so that the employees feel like they have that space? They have that space to just say, you know what, today is not the day I might be able to deliver, I don't know, anything that has a timeline.
Yeah. I think we have to create a space for what I would call iterative learning or incremental learning, in whether that's in a school environment or a work environment. That I'm going to go to Sesame Street for a moment on this. Janelle Monáe has a wonderful song she does for Sesame Street called on the power of yet. And I think workplaces we need to embrace the power of yet. And it's not that today's not the day, it's not working. It's not yet. I'm getting
Yeah.
there, but not yet. And I just think the power of yet needs to be embraced. And it means we have to be okay with, sometimes people use the word failure. I'll say setbacks. That setbacks are a part of learning, and it's where our best learning takes place. So if you want creative responses, are we creating that space for people to test ideas? And are we providing that support to say, that's interesting that it didn't work. How might and who might we draw upon? The other piece, just where I can only take my work so far before I need to bounce my ideas off somebody, because I need another lens. I need other ways. Some would argue that all creativity is collaborative in nature. And by the way, sometimes that means collaborating with the past. It doesn't just mean you and I collaborating today, but whose ideas am I building off from the past? How do I collaborate with thinkers in the past, in the present with me? And what's the value added we're bringing? But I think in a workplace, we need to create that space. And I would argue time is essential. I think that collaboration, and I think offering genuinely helpful guidance to people, less evaluative, but more guiding, if I can distinguish that not making judgments about whether you worked or not, but thoughts around what you might try as an alternative to that. So, how do we provide that workspace where we're colleagues who are guiding the exploration as opposed to managers who are judging the work?
Definitely. And I think in your answer, you just mentioned collaboration, right? And this is something that I have been seeing immensely at all workplaces, right? So we're always working in a team. It's never your idea that goes forward, but it's a team's idea. So, how does collaboration fit into creativity and critical thinking skills? Because as individuals, all of us have such different nuances and different experiences. How do we merge that?
Well, and one of the things I think it's important that we distinguish is there's cooperation and there's collaboration. And the distinction is an important one. That sometimes I will benefit from a conversation with someone who I don't agree with. Okay. We don't reach the same conclusion. I don't share your conclusion, but the journey I went on with you helped grow my thinking. Collaborative thinking is about drawing on my interactions with others to help deepen my personal understanding. it's not always about reaching the same conclusion. So I'll give you a quick example. I might engage with someone of a different political stripe than me, and not in the end, I still don't agree with your political position on that issue, but I have a much better understanding of why some hold that, and that allows me to better respond in certain contexts. So collaboration doesn't mean we have to reach the same conclusion. It does mean we value each other's input, and we are open to considering that input and how it helps advance our work. And I think in some cases that means a team will emerge with it, and sometimes it'll be, I just need to pick the brain of someone. Thanks, I'm going to use that, but I'm going to do that in a way that works for me. So I think we want to allow that collaborative thinking is building on the ideas of others to advance our thinking. Cooperative learning is reaching a together, but that we need to understand sometimes, for example, when I come to you and I say I want to talk, I'm not coming necessarily to reach the same conclusion. I just want to benefit from your insights that are different than mine. So collaboration can be a powerful tool for deepening our understandings. One other just quick, notice I used the word earlier, quality thinking. And at times I wonder, we talk about critical thinking versus creative thinking versus collaborative. And I wonder if it's less about three different ways of thinking and more about all of those are essential components of engaging in quality thinking. And I used the word dimensions earlier. That critical, creative, and collaborative thinking are three dimensions that we want to bring together to advance the quality of the thinking we do. And that we stop seeing these as, now I'm going to engage in creative thinking. Oh, now we're doing collaborative. No, these are three dimensions that support high quality thinking in any context.
Definitely. And when you just, so right now, recently I read a piece where it said that when you're collaborating with people you don't know, then the creative output is much more enhanced or much more superior. Do you agree with that in your personal experience? Do you think that's how it works?
Oh, that's an interesting. Well, I wonder if there are filters that are removed when that's happening. So part of creativity research suggests that we need an old kind of theory that I think has some validity. So is a blind variation selective retention, the BVSR, and the idea is that in the early phase of creativity, we just need fluency. We need to generate lots and lots of ideas, and to do that, we need to lower any kind of cognitive filter. So you don't want to have criteria in place that you have to think about. And I'm wondering, in what you just raised, if I'm working with a new group of people where I don't have preconceived conceptions of and so on, if that helps lower those, and I'm just willing to throw out ideas. By the way, in the second phase, we want to then say, which of those ideas have the greatest value? Well, now I bring in some criteria to guide that. But I wonder if in that early phase, the generation of ideas is more difficult if I'm with people for whom there are a preconceived set of expectations.
So if we are generating something new, then what kind of performance evaluations should a creative team pick for themselves?
Well, I think even more important is that they do pick some. So because the context may differ. A simple way to put it might be, first of all, to consider purpose and audience. One of the things that I was fascinated by a number of years ago, I was presenting Design Institute in America, and some of the engineers said, all design thinking begins with empathy. They said all design has to begin with empathy. Who are you designing for? And if you don't understand that, then I might be designing a car, and if I'm a 30-something engineer, I design the car that I think would be. But what if my major market is an aging population? Am I paying? So how do I understand? So when you ask that question about a team wanting to be creative, well, what is my creative endeavor attempting to do? What is my purpose and who is my audience? And is the solution we're generating addressing the purpose and audience intended? What are we trying to solve? Another criteria, one might be, does this relate well to those two? I might look at how feasible. I mean, we can have great ideas that in my ideal world, but there are constraints. So does the solution we're working on take into account constraints, whether they're budgets, personnel, time, whatever it might be? So how feasible is our solution? I think, and by the way, you'll notice this really requires, or it highlights, that creativity is not something that comes out of that. Creativity always exists within a context. There's an issue, there's a problem, there's something we're trying to improve, we're trying to think about, and my solution needs to align to that. So, what is that? And one other, I don't know if you're familiar with prospective thinking, but I think this fits nicely into the critical and creative intersections. Prospective thinking is future-oriented thinking. So it's using trends and patterns we can recognize to think about how do we build a better future. I was saying to some teachers, phys ed is by its nature a prospective subject, because phys ed is about living a healthy, active life for the future. I would say any, a well-oiled, innovative organization is should be prospective in its thinking. What do the trends show us? What patterns are we recognizing? And are we using those to help frame the solutions we're proposing that will lead us to the better future? So I think part of the solutions are drawing on the past as a way, that's what I said before, collaborating with the past. Are our ideas kind of paying homage to the past? What do we know? What's worked? What hasn't worked? How do we do that? And how do we do it with an eye to the future? And that requires, what are we trying to solve? Who are we trying to solve it for? By the way, I think when the question of barriers or obstacles come up, that's another opportunity for creativity. So we might say, well, right now this isn't feasible, but I'll go back to Janelle Monáe's The Power of Yet. Well, we can't do it yet, but what if we now think creatively about how we remove those obstacles? So there could be layers of creativity within this, that we've got a great idea. Now we have to figure out how to make it happen. And by the way, I would rather talk about obstacles or challenges, not barriers. Barriers have this image of run up against, but obstacle course, you maneuver around, challenges we overcome. So I think if we can get that mindset of, sure, there will be challenges, but creative people find ways around those challenges that address.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's like an intersection of many different things, right? It's not just one thing. So with all of the responses and the questions that we just discussed, right? One thing that I have established is that creativity is a skill that has to be nurtured from a young age. I mean, I might be wrong in my assumption. And you've also written a wonderful book, Creating Thinking Classrooms, right? So that's wherein we are stepping in and helping children from a young age to actually develop the skill. So what about creating thinking workplaces? So how do we suddenly bring in this topic?
Okay. Well, first of all, I just want to, Bruce Nussbaum, in his book on creativity, I think he has a really useful phrase, really short but useful phrase, that creativity is about tools, not light bulbs. And I think that's really important, because I think sometimes we have this mistaken sense that creative people have a lightning bolt that strikes, and that's where their ideas come from.
There's no bulb.
And Nussbaum, points out that's in fact not true. That creative people actually draw on a depth of knowledge in a field they're working in. That if you ask me to choreograph a creative dance, I don't have a dance background, so I'm not going to be able to do I'm not going to be very successful at doing that, because I don't have the background. That creative artists have often deep training in the field they're working in. That creative individuals have a deep understanding of the field in which they want to innovate. And I think one of the pieces we have to keep in mind is that we have to build a toolkit. And I'm going to say, the creating thinking classrooms parallels in that if I just very quickly say, what do we, when we build that creative, that opportunity for thinking in a classroom, and I'll just draw the parallel. One of the things we always have to think about is, have I created the climate where thinking can flourish, whether that's critical or creative? So in a workplace, are we creating the climate where people feel comfortable taking risks, where people feel comfortable that they're feeling rewarded for their efforts? I mean, I think we have to balance this. If I'm generating ideas, but the group takes over the ideas, will I feel like I'm not being valued for my contribution? So how do we balance both the group think, which has value, but also the individual contributions, so that we don't start hiving off the work as that this is my work? So one is building climate. How do we create the climate? The second is, how do we frame the challenges before us in ways that invite thinking, that invite an exploration of ideas, a genuine invitation to let's explore. And then there's the intellectual toolkits that I would just want to quickly mention. And I think these parallel a classroom or a workplace. The first intellectual tools you need to engage critically or creatively. And by the way, these parallels, that's why it's really nice. Yeah. Background knowledge. You can't think deeply about something you know nothing about. So in the workplace, if we are starting to embark on something new, how are we going to build people's comfort level with the area they're working at? If you're taking a new idea in ed tech and saying, okay, I want you to apply that over here. Okay, what do I need to know? How do we make sure that the people working this have access to building their own knowledge base? Number two is criteria. And exactly the question you asked me before. How do we help people work through the criteria they would use and understand the criteria that will guide their thinking? So those two, by the way, those are the two pillars of all thinking. It's, do I have the background knowledge I need? Have I established some criteria to guide me? So I have kind of signposts along the way to say, hey, we're getting there. And how do I know that? Another tool are providing thinking strategies. Now, we tend to do this a lot in schools. I think we could be doing this in workplaces. When you ask me, what are strategies I can use? I said to you before that being creative requires fluency, flexibility. Well, what are strategies we can employ that will help generate ideas, that will help shift us from a very linear way of thinking to lateral moves that yield unexpected ideas that come out of seem to come out of left field, but because we've helped the brain break out of its kind of linear pattern of thinking. And then you had asked earlier as well, well, what are the habits? That's another tool. How do we build the habits among individuals of risk-taking, of being comfortable working together, of persevering? How do we build the habits of good thinking? Those are 4 intellectual tools that I think workplaces need to look at. And if I could just really quickly, as an example, because it's one of my favorite, this is a sample. Think when I say fluency. I don't know if you're familiar with synesthesia as it's a condition in the brain where the wiring of the brain in some people crosses over so that, and there can be multiple forms of synesthetes. So I might, for some synesthetes, numbers, they equate a color to a number. So 5 is purple, or music, like you see music. And so synesthetes have, and they tend to be highly creative people because they make connections that are non-obvious. So we developed a strategy around that to help anyone do that. So if I said to you, we just take the 5 senses, and I might say, if fairness were a shape, what shape is fair? And notice you might go, well, I never thought of fairness as a shape, but if it was, well, a circle, because okay, give me another shape. By the way, notice it's not get one shape, it's give me another. Okay, those are interesting. What if fairness were a color? What color is fair? What does fair taste like? What's it smell like? And by the way, the brain is now going, wait a minute, I don't normally equate fair with colors, with taste, with smells. But when I do, I get these interesting ideas that start to emerge. If you're a writer and you're looking for some descriptive language that's, unusually effective, you might say, well, if I start connecting, you know, a romantic relationship to a smell. I might suddenly describe things in a way that, wow, how do you come up with that? Well, these kind of strategies can be helpful when we say, well, if this is our challenge, let's just get ideas on the table, and we teach strategies that encourage fluency and flexibility. By the way, the next strategy is, now that we've got the ideas, now let's provide structures that allow you to apply the criteria, and how do we do that in an organized way. So what I'm getting at is, when we bring together background knowledge, criteria, thinking strategies, and tools, then I think we get beyond just waiting for the lightning bolt to hit us.
Yeah, I think that was a wonderful answer. So we have the 4 tools, and the main part is creativity is not a light bulb. I mean, I clearly have a light bulb, but they are tools, right? So
Yes.
I would like to wrap this up with, um, so in your experience, do you have any resource or book recommendation for people that they just have to pick up and understand how creativity or critical thinking works?
I'm going to mention a couple that I have
Yep.
found. So one, first of all, Keith Sawyer, Sawyer. Keith Sawyer has just written a lot of really good stuff.
Yep.
He's got one book on creativity that I would say just kind of the Bible of it, just synthesizes. But one of his books from a few years ago is called Zigzag, and
Mhm.
it is really it's both Zigzag both addresses these issues of creativity, but with very practical, concrete strategies that I was talking about. That it's a really nice blend of theory around creativity as thinking, as quality thinking, and practical strategy. So the book Zigzag is a good one. Burval, Amy Burval,
Mhm.
Burv, I think AL. Amy Burval's book on intentions, critical creativity. It's less theory, but early on she talks about that the idea of critical creativity, that it's purposeful, it's intentional. But then it's basically a book of 44 strategies, and each strategy, here's the strategy, here's what it might look like, here's what it looks like in different contexts. Like it's, I tell my students, it's just a wealth of, if I'm just looking for strategies, it's a good
Yeah.
book for that. The other person I would just say, not necessarily a book, but articles, or has a TED talk that's worth looking at, is Rex Young, Jung, like Carl Jung. Rex
Okay.
Young
Mhm.
is a cognitive neuroscientist at Albuquerque University, but his research is the neuroscience of creativity. So his interest is what's happening in the brain when we engage in what we consider creative activity, what's happening. And one of the things that Rex will point out is there's no part of the brain devoted to creativity. That's a myth. There's no part of the brain that lights up. In fact, creativity, truly creative people, it's the interhemispheric connections that the brain makes. The brain, it's how the right and left side play together, as opposed to this idea of right or left side. So, if I were go on a continuum, Rex is really kind of important research around the neuroscience of creativity and how the brain engages in creative exercise. Keith is that in between kind of the theory of creativity and some practical strategies. And Amy is a whole big collection of creative strategies. So that might help. That's kind of 3 across the range.
For sure. I think these are wonderful resources. And I hope, to everyone who's watching this, this was very informative, and you can take this back to your workplaces, or even best just show it to your managers, right? Because we need that creative space. But thank you so much, Mr. Garfield. This was amazing and really, as I said, informational and necessary, especially in the new job market.
Great. Thank you so much. I sure enjoyed it.